Ready when you are, Mr. Chair.
All right, let's get started. All right, welcome everyone to the Boston MPO meeting today. Let me read a few of the opening slides that we've all become accustomed to. You're invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender, identity, or expression, veteran status, or background. As we all know, where this meeting will be held virtually, all participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please make sure to rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Betsy Harvey via the chat box, also at eharvey, E-H-A-R-V-E-Y at ctps.org, or 857-702-3701. Our accessibility statement is this meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please again contact Betsy Harvey at MPO staff at eharvey, E-H-A-R-V-E-Y at ctps.org, or 857-702-3701. All right, with that, we're in introduction. So Jonathan, do you want to go ahead and read the roll, please?
Certainly. Mass DOT's chair.
Steve Wolf, representing Secretary and CEO of MassDOT, Jamie Tesler.
Mass DOT seat 2.
John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver, present.
Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
MBTA.
Sorry for the delay. Jillian Linnell on behalf of General Manager Steve Poptek.
Great, thank you. Massport.
Sarah Lee, representing Massport.
Great. MAPC Vice Chair.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Sorry about that, a little bit delay on the button. This is Leonard Diggins representing the MBTA Right Oversight Committee on the Advisory Council. And I just want to point out that the link on the calendar page to the Zoom session doesn't work as one would expect it to. Maybe it's just me, but it took me back to the calendar page being in. And so I had to then go to the agenda in order to get the link to the Zoom session. I say that just in case other people are having problems. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take a look at that. Thank you, Leonard.
No problem.
City of Boston, BTD.
Bill Conroy here, representing Mayor Wu in the City of Boston.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hey, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA representing Mayor Wu in the City of Boston.
Thanks. At large city, City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
Thanks. At large city, City of Newton.
David Kosis, representing Mayor Ruth M. Fuller in the City of Newton.
At large town, Town of Arlington.
This is Daniel Amstutz, representing Select Board Chair Len Diggins and the town of Arlington.
At-large town, town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, everybody. This is Brad Rawson. I serve the city of Somerville, represent Mayor Ballantyne and the MEPC Intercore.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, town of Acton.
Good morning, Austin Saganowitz, town of Acton, representing the Magic subregion.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham. I believe Eric Johnson is here for Dennis Jean Betty today.
Thank you.
Eric Johnson represents City Framingham Metro West Regional Collaborative here.
Thanks. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing the North Shore Task Force, and Mayor Cahill for the city of Beverly.
North Suburban Planning Council, town of Burlington.
Not seen Melissa Tentakos.
Okay. South Shore Coalition, town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, town of Rockland for the South Shore Coalition.
Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, town of Medway.
Not seeing Peter Pelletier.
And Three Rivers and a Local Council, town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, I muted myself. All right, thank you, Jonathan. Welcome again, everyone. I do have a chair's report. So three things. One is that we will be having a public meeting for the Beyond Mobility Long Range Plan. It'll be happening at 6 p.m. tonight through Zoom. If you have any questions, just reach out to Derek Cravat here. And we can also share, Derek, with Jonathan, some of the links to join the meeting tonight. So please be on the lookout for that. Two, I know that Derek was here last meeting and talked a little bit about a safe routes to infrastructure upcoming solicitation for new projects. It's currently open. I've asked Derek to share with Jonathan the slides. I know we're not gonna have time to go over them today, and we didn't have time to go over the last meeting. So please make sure you are on the lookout. That process ends, I believe, on November 18th. Applications are due. So Jonathan, if you can send it out right after this meeting so people can take a look at it, please. It spells out what's eligible, what are eligible projects, what aren't, and gives a timeline. And so please take a look at that when Jonathan sends it out after this meeting. Lastly, if folks are planning to go and moving together, we had sent out on our website that we were closing registrations on the 25th, this coming Tuesday. We are not going to make it to that. We're already almost to 1,000. So if you're really going to go, you need to register probably today, because I'm likely going to close out registration and shut it off and sell it out tomorrow. So please, if you're interested, please act on that now, because probably by the end of the day, you won't be able to. So I will note, though, we will be keeping, there is a virtual component. It will be a hybrid conference, and people can still join that way. But if you're planning on in person, probably just have till today to be able to register. All right. With that, I will turn it over to Tegan for the executive director's report. Go ahead, Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We received some positive feedback last time on having a few slides to set the framework for the executive director's report. So we'll continue with that. And I also just want to start off by saying, please forgive my voice. I have a head cold and I'll project as best as I can. So the first topic we wanted to cover today, if we can go to the next slide, is an update on the elections. And if I may, Mr. Chair, for this, I'd like to pass it off to Eric Barassa to give this particular update.
Absolutely. Take it away, Eric.
Thank you, Tegan. We have, and I want to thank the MPO for extending the deadline for nominations for the Magic subregion. We did receive nominations from the town of Acton for the Magic seat. So we now have nominations from the city of Somerville for the Inner Core subregion seat, from the city of Framingham for the Metro West Collaborative subregion seat, from the town of Hull for the South Shore Coalition seat, and now, as I said, the town of Acton for the Magic seat. The voting is now live, and we have sent out the links to the electronic ballot. Again, it is the chief sort of executive official in the municipality. In most cases, that is the mayor. In some cases, in a city, or the city manager. In some cases, the president of the city council. And in most cases in towns, that's the chair of the select board. We've sent that information out. Maybe staff could post a link if they have that accessible to the page where we have those links. Again, it is just the municipalities in the subregion that vote for those subregion seats. And and the voting will be from, it's live. It will end on the 26th, and we will announce, obviously, these seats are unopposed, but we will formally announce the results at the MAPC Fall Council meeting at 9:30 on Thursday, October 27th. So if folks have any questions about that, let me know. I'm happy to answer anything now, or connect with anybody offline as well.
Anybody have any questions for Eric? All right, I don't see any. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
We'll go back to Tegan. Take it away, Tegan.
Thanks, Steve. So the next topic we'll move on to is updates on our staffing. We do have a job posted right now for a program manager for the MPO's performance-based planning and programming activities. And this will also provide some support to the long-range transportation plan work, and also coordinate with the congestion management process. So this is an important position. It'll be open through November 3rd. And I ask that, as always, board members, if you can help us share with your networks and send us good candidates, we would appreciate it. Next, we have a few engagement highlights related to past and upcoming events and meetings. First, related to the fall sub-regional meetings, we actually just hosted yesterday an Inner Core Committee Transportation Group meeting where we discussed new demographic forecasting, the long-range transportation priorities, and some updates on timelines and ways to get engaged in the LRTP, the long-range plan, the TIP, and the UPWP. So we'll continue these meetings with sub-regional groups to discuss these topics and really to focus on the sub-region's transportation priorities. And again, I encourage you all as board members to attend the meetings when they're in your sub-regions as part of the way in which you as an MPO board member can help engage the stakeholders that you represent. So if you have questions about this, please contact Stella Jordan, who's our public engagement program manager. She can tell you anything more you need to know about those meetings, and we'll post the dates of upcoming meetings in the chat just for your reference. It looks like we lost the slide screen, so I'll just keep chatting for a moment and hopefully they'll come back up. That was fast loading, good job. So just as a reminder, we also have some transit working group coffee chats coming up in November. The first is on the November 1st, and it will focus on a very interesting case study of the launch of the successful Berkshire Flyer Amtrak service between New York and Pittsfield this past summer. And then the second one on November 16th will focus on the development of the MPO's Destination 2050 Long-Range Transportation Plan and updated coordinated plan. Again, I believe we will share registration for both events in the chat. And so with that, we can turn over to the next slide and today's agenda items, where we have two major items, major action items for your voting. The first one is going to be a presentation by Michelle Scott, followed by discussions and votes to approve new CMAQ performance targets. And the second will be a presentation, discussion, and vote to release Amendment 1 of the federal fiscal year 23 to 27 TIP for a 21-day public comment period as an amendment. And just to highlight now, the primary purpose of that is to make changes to the MBTA's TIP program, as well as to accommodate 2 cost increases for community connections projects, balanced out by a decrease for one of the intersection improvement projects. But you will hear much more from Ethan Lapointe, our newer TIP manager, later at the meeting. And then last slide, as a reminder, the next meeting is scheduled for November 3rd. Per Eric's comments earlier, it will be the first meeting following the MPO elections. So it will be the first meeting for any newly elected board members. And it will also need to include the nomination of and a vote to select a vice chair for the board, which is currently held by and has been held for quite some time by MAPC. And then we'll likely have 2 work scopes. This will be an important month or 2 for work scopes as we're developing new scopes for the discrete studies that we identified in the UPWP, as well as other new work that comes up at this time in the beginning of the federal fiscal year. And we'll have 2 presentations, one on developing baseline transportation equity indicators for the Boston region, and then another is the sub-regional roadway study for a project in Canton. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to turn it over to today's agenda.
Any questions for Tegan? All right, seeing them, before we move to public comment, I know that Brian Kane would like to be recognized to make a statement. So go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. I wanted to address things that I said at the July 21st MPO meeting with respect to the Minuteman bike path extension in Bedford. I've talked to several folks in Bedford, and I just wanted to apologize to not only to the folks in Bedford, but to my colleagues here. I got that one wrong. I spoke to some folks in Bedford that I've known for a long time who I thought had the pulse of the town, and I just was wrong. They certainly didn't, and the information that was passed on to me, which I then passed on to this body, was just incorrect. I apologize for misleading the MPO. I've spoken to several people in Bedford trying to atone for my incorrect information there, and I understand that some folks are still upset. I get it, and they should be, and they have every right to be. So I will continue to reach out to folks in Bedford as best I can, as I can identify them. I have educated myself on this topic by reading things like the Bedford Chronicle, spoken to other folks who actually really do have the pulse of the town. And it's clear that my statements there were just incorrect. So I appreciate you, Mr. Chair, recognizing me to make this. And again, apologies to all affected. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brian. All right, let's move on to the next agenda item, which is public comments. Are there any members of the public who'd like to address the MPO today? I don't see anything. Jonathan, CTPS staff, anyone see anyone? I don't see anyone raising their hand, so.
Nope. No, we don't, Mr. Chair.
All right, let's move on to agenda item 5, which is committee chairs reports. I know that Derek has one for the UPWP committee, and I'm guessing that Brian has one for ANF. So Derek, why don't you go first, and then Brian, I'll recognize you. Go ahead, Derek.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Yep, just wanted to quickly mention that the UPWP committee will be meeting next at 1 p.m. on November 3rd. After the MPO meeting that day, the main agenda items will be Amendment 1 to the federal fiscal year 2023 Unified Planning Work Program, which has to do with budget adjustments to the MAPC section, as well as some adjustments of internal project budgets. So more information will be sent prior to that meeting by staff, but just wanted to mention so folks are aware we'll be meeting on November 3rd. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Derek. Brian, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so the Administration and Finance Committee met today, not on the topic of the operations plan as we have been, but on the topic of CTPS budgeting. We reviewed first quarter fiscal 23 results for revenue and expenditure, as well as the overhead rate. Things are generally in the right direction. The first quarter is always kind of tough to get right because so many things are in flux given vacation schedules, et cetera. But Haral did a great job explaining kind of where we're at. Directionally, the committee, the sense of the committee is that we're headed directionally in the right path, the right way, and that the budget should be more or less balanced soon, sort of by the second or third quarter. So we are happy with that. Very grateful to the staff for their transparency, and look forward to continuing to update the MPO on where the budget is headed. Thank you, sir.
Anyone have any questions for Brian? All right, thank you, Brian. All right, let's move on to the next agenda item, which is the council report from the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Leonard, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we had, at our last meeting, Michelle Scott came to talk with us or meet with us and discuss the advisory council's feelings, thoughts about goals and visions for the next long-range transportation plan. It was a really delightful conversation, and I hope that Michelle had enjoyed being with us as much as we enjoyed talking and working with her. And at our next meeting, I think Tegan, our executive director, is going to come and talk with us about other MPOs. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you.
All right, any questions for Leonard? Brad, you have a question? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Len, appreciate the chair's report. I do want to point out to this board that we have had a series of public meetings, including the MBTA Advisory Board's Forum on the Future of the MBTA, in which appointed and elected officials, including our mayor, Mayor Ballantyne, very explicitly connected the dots between our RTAs and the MBTA, and recognize that as we plan together for the future, for the next 10 years and beyond, that it's really important that folks in the MBTA service area continue to put themselves in the shoes of RTA members. This is a theme that has come up in this board, and I just wanted to take a moment to reinforce the value of that inter-regional collaboration. We're all in this together. So thanks for all your hard work, Len, and to all of our other members in the RTAC universe. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. All right, with that, I don't think anyone had any questions for Len, so we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is an action item, approval of the MPO meeting minutes for September 1st. Can I get a motion, a second to approve, please? Brian?
Move to approve, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second? Tom, I assume you're the second?
Yes, a second.
All right, anyone have any comments, questions, or changes to the minutes? All right, seeing none. Jonathan, please read the roll.
Steve Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee abstain.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Hey, Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton, oh, could you repeat that, Heather? I don't think we got it.
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Thank you. Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Austin Zaganowitz,
Austin Siganowitz abstains.
Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson abstain.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier has joined us during the meeting, so I'd like to recognize him for the vote and to also call for the roll.
Peter Pelletier abstains.
Thank you. And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jonathan. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is also an action item. It's agenda item 8, congestion mitigation, air quality performance targets. And I believe this is Michelle. So take it away, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. So I'll be speaking with you today about a 2022 update to our congestion mitigation and air quality improvement, or CMAQ, performance targets. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to touch on some higher level points from this presentation before digging into a bit more detail. So first, the purpose of today's discussion, the U.S. Department of Transportation requires transportation agencies, including states and MPOs, to set targets for congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program, or CMAQ, performance measures. These fall into two categories. The first are traffic congestion related measures that are set at the urbanized area level, and I'll talk a little bit more in the presentation about what that area refers to, and also state and MPO level emissions reduction measure that is focused on the anticipated impacts of CMAQ projects funded in air quality monitoring areas. Next slide, please. So the work that's been done thus far, the Boston Region MPO staff has been working with MassDOT, the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, and the Northern Middlesex MPO to propose some UZA level targets for traffic congestion based on recent travel trends and uncertainties. And staff from the Boston Region MPO are also proposing a carbon monoxide, or CO, emissions reduction target based on a project that'll overlap Waltham, which has historically been our air quality limited maintenance area. Next slide, please. So at the conclusion of today's presentation, I'm going to request that the MPO take a vote to adopt the proposed CMAQ traffic congestion targets so that we are reporting consistently with our partners in the urbanized area, as well as request a vote to adopt the emissions reduction target. Mr. Chair, if it's all right, after covering the traffic congestion targets, could I take a pause for some clarifying questions before talking about the emissions reduction one?
Absolutely, Michelle. Go ahead.
All right, great, thank you. Next slide, please. So this family of performance targets are some that we talk about a little less frequently at the MPO. We talk about roadway safety, transit safety, and transit asset management on an annual basis, but these CMAQ targets are part of a family of targets we discuss every 2 to 4 years. Other targets in this family that we'll be talking about later this fall and into the winter include targets related to bridge condition, pavement condition, and travel time reliability. Next slide, please. A little bit of background on the CMAQ program. This is one of the major federal funding programs through which Massachusetts and the Boston Region MPO specifically gets funding to program on transportation projects in the region. And the specific goal of this program is to support projects that will reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality. And this is particularly the case for areas of the country that currently don't attain or have not attained in the past nationally established air quality standards. So the funds that come through the CMAQ program can be applied to a variety of project types. The CMAQ program, for example, supports our Community Connections program, which funds projects ranging from new shuttle services to bike share stations to bike parking and things of that nature. The CMAQ funding can also support a variety of other project types. We've used it to partially fund our corridor and intersection projects in combination with other federal sources, and CMAQ funds have also been used to fund the MPO's contributions to the Green Line extension. Next slide, please. So this table covers more specifically the measures we'll be talking about today. There are 2 measures in the traffic congestion category. The first is the percent of non-SOV or single occupancy vehicle travel happening in the Boston urbanized area. This is something we want to grow over time. The other traffic congestion target is annual hours of peak hour excessive delay per capita. And this is something I'll break down a little bit later in the presentation, but it's a measure that captures the amount of delay that people are experiencing traveling specifically on the national highway system. This also is measured at the Boston UCA level, and it's a value that we want to go down. Finally, the emissions reduction measure, and I'll just kind of recap this, is the total emissions reduction for applicable pollutants and precursors for CMAQ funded projects in designated non-attainment and maintenance areas. So this is really trying to capture what we think the benefits of CMAQ funded projects will be in specific air quality areas within the region. And of course, a little counterintuitive, we want there to be more emissions reduction. So we want that value to go up. Next slide, please. So how do federal requirements apply to the MPO specifically and govern how we need to respond to some of these requirements? So the federal agencies, FHWA in particular, looks at 3 different criteria. They look at whether an MPO region contains a air quality non-attainment or maintenance area. Basically, what that means, a non-attainment area means that the area is not attaining air quality standards for pollutants such as carbon monoxide or nitrous oxide or volatile organic compounds today, recently, whereas a maintenance area is referring to an area that hasn't attained those standards in the past, has since achieved those standards, but needs some ongoing monitoring to make sure that there isn't backsliding. So in the MPO region, we've had historically had a carbon monoxide limited maintenance area in Waltham. This designation has actually just expired, but for the time being, we still need to fulfill these performance requirements until FHWA does another one of these criteria reviews. So there's 2 other criteria. One looks at whether our MPO is in an urbanized area with one of these air quality non-attainment or maintenance areas and a population of greater than 200,000. Also looks at whether our MPO overlaps the national highway network in that urbanized area. Boston MPO meets both of those criteria, and so we need to meet the traffic congestion requirements as well. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of things that the MPO has to do? Well, first we set targets with partners in the urbanized area and for our own region, and we're talking about that today. We also develop CMAQ performance plans that describe our targets as well as the CMAQ projects happening in the region. And we also report on targets and progress towards those targets in our LRTP, Long Range Transportation Plan, and TIP. So there aren't specific rewards or penalties that come to states and MPOs for this family of targets. The FHWA does monitor our performance. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk specifically about the traffic congestion measures. Next slide, please. So this slide shows on the right-hand side a map of the Boston urbanized area. I should have mentioned at the outset that on the MPO meeting calendar for today, we do have a memo that goes along with this presentation. If you're following along, this map appears on page 6. You can see in the green that the urbanized area extends through most of eastern Massachusetts. It goes up into parts of New Hampshire and down into Rhode Island. Based on the criteria outlined on the previous slide, we have 4 major partners in setting the CMAQ traffic congestion targets. They include Mass DOT, the New Hampshire DOT, and the Northern Middlesex MPO, which is part of the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments. You'll see on the map that there are other MPOs in this region, but they don't face the same requirements in terms of having to coordinate on these targets. Next slide, please. So talking first about the % of non-SOV travel, the reason we measure this is because As we're moving away from using single occupancy vehicles, transit or other modes, there's opportunities to decrease congestion and improve air quality. There are a couple of ways that this can be measured, but in our urbanized area, we look specifically at the US Census American Community Survey and estimates of how people are commuting to work. And so to calculate the non-SOV measure for our region using this method, we take a look at the percent of people who are driving alone, subtract that from 1, and get our non-SOV travel measure. For this measure, we have to set 2 targets. One is a 2-year target reflecting a 5-year American Community Survey estimate for this measure for 2019 to 23, and a 4-year target reflecting a 21 to 25 ACS estimate. Next slide, please. So this chart here shows kind of some historic changes in this measure over time, as shown by the line in dark blue. You'll notice there are some kind of lines on either side of that. That kind of reflects the upper and lower bounds of this estimate based on margins of error that are reported by the American Community Survey. You can also see our historic targets set during the last cycle for non-SOV travel for the Boston urbanized area. You can see that this measure has been gradually going up over time. You can also notice on that 16 to 20 estimate, that significant jump. And that was shaped largely by the conditions related to the pandemic, particularly the transition many made to working from home. Next slide, please. So in thinking about setting new targets, Mass DOT, folks from New Hampshire, the Northern Middlesex MPO, and MPO staff kind of looked at non-overlapping estimates from the ACS per federal guidance to start to determine what the best trend line might look like going forward. And this highlights a couple of different factors that we were considering. Of course, as you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that businesses and governments responded to the pandemic did impact travel patterns pretty significantly. There were noteworthy decreases in VMT and transit ridership in the early days of the pandemic. While things have increased in both of those metrics since then, we're not all the way back to pre-COVID levels at this point. Remote work rates have also fluctuated over this period. Although based on some preliminary research that MassDOT is conducting, we expect to see that remote work will continue to trend at higher than pre-pandemic levels. And we're also considering that when we're thinking about the future, the MPO is certainly going to be continuing to work with MassDOT and other MPOs in Massachusetts to invest in transit and other non-SOV travel options, which we hope will affect the value of this measure continuing to increase over time. Next slide, please. So this measure shows another projected trend line that is shaped by those factors that I just described. Looking at a trend line that doesn't quite build in that very transformative jump that happened during the pandemic, but still shows the ongoing higher than pre-pandemic levels of remote work, as well as the impacts of ongoing investment in non-SOV options. Next slide, please. And so this slide shows the proposed targets that we've been working on with our partners in the urbanized area, with a 2-year target of, excuse me, I actually got this so small on my own screen, I can't see the value. I believe that's 38.9%. And a 4-year value of 38.8%, excuse me, and a 4-year value of 39.8%. You'll notice that this is kind of pegged to that upper bound of that trend line estimate based on ACS estimates going forward. I'm now going to turn on the next slide, please, Logan, to the other measure in the traffic congestion family, which is annual hours of peak hour excessive delay per capita. So the focus here is how much excessive delay beyond a certain threshold are people experiencing as they're traveling on the national highway system. So we're looking at data specifically related to travel on the NHS, and then we're normalizing that by the overall urbanized area population. As with the non-SOV targets, we're covering that information for targets for the same time frame. We're looking at a 2-year target reflecting as of the end of 2023 and a 4-year target that reflects conditions as of the end of 2025. Next slide, please. So this graphic, which is adapted a little bit from one produced by FHWA, shows all the different components that go into this peak hour of excessive delay measure. So it's a function of how long it takes to travel down a segment of National Highway System roadway, and whether how that compares to how long it would take if you were traveling at a particular threshold speed. So the amount of time that it takes in real life compared to that threshold speed, if it's taking more time in real life, we're accounting for that excess time value as the excessive delay. And that factor gets applied to the number of people who are traveling along that segment over the course of a year for different time periods. And we account for not only traffic volumes, but the expected vehicle occupancy of those vehicles when we're kind of rolling up this measure to get an overall estimate of person hours of delay. And then, of course, normalizing by the UZA population is where we get that per capita piece of the estimate. Next slide, please. So we measure this information using travel time data that's coming from the National Performance Management Research data set. This is INRIX data. This is the same data we use for other activities in our congestion management process. And we'll be coming back to this data set a little later in the fall and winter when we're talking about travel time reliability. And I just kind of covered the other steps in the calculation, working with vehicle volumes, occupancy factors, looking at peak periods, and then normalizing by the UZA population. Next slide, please. So this slide shows kind of past trends in the value of this measure over time, as well as past targets that have been set for the Boston UZA. If you're following along on the memo, I believe this figure, or a figure that captures the same information, starts on page 15. That dark blue line is the actual value of the measure, and the light blue and purple diamonds reflect the targets. When we were first doing this, monitoring this measure in the past cycle, we didn't have a lot of historic data to work from based on what was available through the National Performance Management Research data set. So at the time, based on FHWA guidance, we set targets at the UZA level reflecting the baseline that we could calculate. And as you can kind of see, over time, past trends have certainly increased above that target value in 2018 and 2019. Then with the onset of the pandemic, dropped pretty significantly. And as of data showing for 2021, we're roughly back to around that target level. Next slide, please. So how do we start to think about the future, given all the uncertainties we've experienced in terms of travel over the past 2 years or so? So in working with MPOs and other state partners in the UZA, MassDOT staff started by looking at a 5% growth rate in this measure over the next couple years. Next slide, please. But as also as part of that process, how do we account for the uncertainty that we're likely to face? Looking back at the past, we can also see that, depending on travel demand on the national highway system, this measure should travel come back, get up much higher than we might expect. So these 3 trend lines that you see on the right-hand side of this figure kind of capture the potential ranges of uncertainty that the group of agencies were considering when we were thinking about setting targets. Next slide, please. So given the great deal of uncertainty that's expected in the near term, the agencies working together propose a target of 24 hours of peak hour excessive delay per capita. This is higher than targets that we've set in the past, which were based on very limited historic information. It is not as high as this measure has been in past years, but it does give some room to still achieve a target while accounting for the uncertainty that may take place in terms of travel demand on the national highway system in the near term. Next slide, please. Over the longer term, the group of agencies working on these targets is proposing one for 22 for that condition reflecting the end of 2025. And this reflects, some activities to kind of mitigate that growth in travel demand and peak hour excessive delay. Should we see a more return of travel demand and vehicle congestion in the coming years based on that range of uncertainty that we were looking at. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the point where I know I've covered a lot in the past couple slides. So before I move on to the emissions reduction target, I just wanted to take any clarifying questions, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Eric, you got a question?
I do. And Michelle, thank you. This is very, especially this last set of slides is very complicated. Could you go back? I just really want to wrap my brain around the methodology again.
I have to do it.
Could you go back to the peak hour delay, just so I understand again? These numbers are in hours, of course, right? Per capita hours. And,
sure.
And then the methodology, I think it was like a slide back.
Do you want to look at that graphic one that I showed? Would that be helpful?
The graph where it had like the time. So I'm just trying to understand how that, so it's like we look at sections of the highway system, right? And then we look at, so the excessive delay threshold is.
Yeah, so that threshold is based on whether what the travel time would be if a person was traveling at 20 miles per hour or at 60% of the speed limit. And it varies by segment, and it tends to be whichever of the two is greater. Okay. So in this example, it works out the same. The amount of time expected to travel down this half-mile segment at 20 miles per hour would be 90 seconds. And in this particular example, it's actually taking 105. So that difference, that 15 seconds becomes the excessive delay.
And then you multiply that by the amount of people and by the amount of peak periods, right? And then you divide that by, okay. So I get how that, I get that methodology. So the question I have is, so in the previous, when we look at the sort of the SOV travel, we see that we're predicting, less single occupancy vehicle percent of travel, right, over time. But I guess that's not enough to change that peak hours of delay, because I guess there'll be more in aggregate. There will be, while the percentage of SOV travel will be less, the overall number of single occupant vehicles on the roadway will be greater. Is that right?
Yeah, there is kind of a loose relationship between the two, and it's kind of the function of the data sets that we're looking at also. So one factor that kind of can contribute to the potential difference is the fact that the measure we're using to capture non-SOV travel is particularly focused on trips to work, based on the metric that we're using for the American Community Survey. Of course, that's a good kind of barometer, but it certainly doesn't cover all of trips. So people may not be using SOV modes for work as much, but it's possible that they're still using them for other trip making patterns. And I think, moving from that overall percentage to kind of the actual values that we're using to do the peak hour excessive delay calculation can be a factor in that too. So if we have kind of an overall growing population, growing number of people using the roadway network, that like overall pie gets bigger, which can contribute to larger potential actual values in the peak hour excessive delay metric. And again, we're also, in looking at the peak hour excessive delay, looking at particular times of day. So again, that kind of makes for a looser relationship between these two traffic congestion targets. I hope that helps.
It does, and I would assume that another reason why we're picking a target, or you guys are estimating here based on, an increase, that we're going to see an increase in person hour delay. It always feels bad when the target is an increase, right? Because it's like, well, I thought we were trying to do things that are bending the curve, but I assume it's because we are projecting a modest population growth, and so with that comes more vehicle miles traveled per capita, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll mention too, or reiterate also, is that when we set that early target, that was, back a couple years, and that's a cycle ago. And Logan, if you could go, I think 2 or 3 slides ahead, to show that, next slide, maybe one more. Thanks. We were setting that initial target in the last cycle of 18.3 with very little historical data to work from. Now we're kind of operating from a place where we have seen more patterns over time, and are trying to set an approach that, based on more understanding of the historical data and looking out to the uncertainties ahead, may be more attainable than approach we took in the past. And I guess when you're talking about, I think, bending the curve, what we're trying to do is bend that curve over a longer time scale than we will think will be attainable at that 2-year mark.
And can you go to the next slide? So the target is, maybe it's 2 forward.
Yeah, 2. If you could go 2, 3, maybe 1 more, Logan, to show both.
So it's 24 hours and 22.
Yes. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to, if it's okay, to give an opportunity. Derek, I don't know if you wanted to add anything based on the context I've given thus far.
Go ahead, Derek.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I can definitely jump in here. So I think the reason that the 24 is higher than the 18.3 is to do with the sort of trend lines of data that we did have. So we're kind of looking at it as somewhat aspirational in the sense that it's still lower than the most recent year of kind of actual data that we have that we consider reliable, which is 2019. So we're looking at that as, although it is an increase from the past target, which, like Michelle mentioned, was kind of based on some faulty data and some data issues at the time, we're kind of viewing it as a reduction from that last year of available data. So in that sense, if when we discussed this, we talked about it as looking at it kind of coming down from that 25.2 number and aiming to use, the tools at our disposal to decrease from 25 to 24 and then ultimately to 22 for that 4-year target. So that was kind of the high level conceptual rationale. Obviously, there's no perfect science to this, or exact science, but we did kind of discuss that sort of balance between being aspirational while also accounting for actual data and being realistic in that sense. So some additional thoughts on that one.
So I know we have some other people like to ask questions. So I have Daniel and Leonard, and then Ken, and then Eric, if you have some others, bring them up. But let's get to some others for now. So Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think you answered most of the questions I was going to ask was going to be about the higher number. And I guess maybe just to dig in slightly more is and right, this is the number we want to go down, not to go up. But I understand the kind of like, this is would be lower than our higher point, and that, like Michelle, you were saying, bending the curve down over a longer period of time. I guess I'm wondering, why would you choose 24 over, or like the 15% annual growth annual growth rate seems rather high, very significant, and why you wouldn't choose the 10% sort of in the middle one, unless the hope is that, if you choose the higher one and we come in lower than that, then that's kind of where, over delivering a little bit by thinking it was going to be higher, but actually it's going to be less. So it's to me, it's sort of funny to call this a target. It seems more like an estimate, or like a sort of like a hope of like, this is what we want, or this is, we hope it doesn't get up to the higher number from 2019, but we want to try to get it, keep going down from there, while also thinking that it might, it's going to go up because of these other factors. We do want it to go down. So I guess I'm just trying to understand why maybe the larger number was chosen, or if it's unless it's just, again, to see, hopefully you don't actually reach that, but we actually get under that in the future.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think the way you characterized it in your statement, that kind of over-delivering piece, is probably a good way to characterize it. Derek, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think overall, we tried to be a little more conservative with regard to the target setting, just to see how things shake out because of the uncertainty associated with sort of returning traffic and things like that from COVID. So we wanted to be a little bit kind of more conservative in that sense. And there is an opportunity to revisit the targets at I think the 2-year reporting period. So we can always make an adjustment to any of these numbers as we get more data in. But it's sort of just that balancing act of, thinking about actually meeting the targets and seeing some decrease, and having the certainty of the data. So yeah, I think that's, we talked a lot about it a lot, and that was sort of the determination, was to use kind of the more conservative and looser estimates at this time, and have the opportunity to revisit when we have more data.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Leonard, and then Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Michelle, thanks for the upper and lower bands and the estimates. I appreciate that. And you can give me really quick answers to these. So on the population, the peak hour assessed delay. I understand how you did the calculations, but then I'm interested in why at the end is the division by the entire population for the area. Because it just seems like the effect is on the people who are in the congestion, and those are where how you calculate the numerator, but then you do this denominator, that now spreads it out across the entire population, thereby decreasing that value and not necessarily reflecting who's affected by the congestion.
That's a really good question, Len. And I'll admit that that's an aspect of it that I haven't thought about in a long time.
I know it's not you who does it. It's just
No. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I know that one of the factors that may have contributed to it, I know that when the federal agencies were putting out the proposed rules that were specifying these measures, I think they may have actually had a couple in this traffic congestion family in play, and the normalization may be a function of trying to combine those measures into one as part of responding to comments from that proposed rulemaking. But it could also be a function of maybe not knowing exactly, maybe trying to capture the range of people who could possibly be affected by that congestion. But the truth is, off the top of my head, I'm not really sure about the history of that.
That's fine. And I may ask some other questions later on. We'll move on to Ken and then let you get on with the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Ken, go ahead. Thanks, Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Michelle. Very comprehensive presentation. Very nice. So two things. One, Len, I was just going to point out exactly what you just said, which was that it's congestion per capita, not per driver or passenger in a vehicle. Like Michelle, I can't exactly tell you why that's what was selected, but I just do want to point out that it actually really then drastically underestimates what drivers are proceeding, right? In the field. The other thing I want to point out is, as Michelle mentioned, a lot of the information is from the American Community Survey, which people used to know, the journey to work information. And it is, remember, work travel is only about a third. It used to be about only a third of travel, and now maybe even less, maybe a quarter or so of total travel. So the estimates, and typically, work travel has much higher single occupancy vehicle mode share than non-work travel. So in a sense, that's also underestimating the amount of folks that are driving alone. It's probably much higher than that if you look at total travel. But I did have a question about the targets. I'm glad you kept this slide up, Michelle. I guess my question relates to why did we, and I know Derek, but why did, what strategies do you hope to implement from 2023 to 25 that would actually lead you to having this reduction? I understand being aspirational, that's a good thing. These are just targets. They're not necessarily estimates, by the way. They are targets. And so it's just, you know, the MPO and the state can be as aspirational as they want to be in selecting a target. But then it seems that there should be some kind of strategy or that's being thought of to say, okay, fine, if we have, you know, an estimate of, 24 in 2023, but we want to be aspirational and in 2025 and lower the target, there needs to be some thought, okay, well, how are you going to do that? Rather than just selecting it. I'll just leave that as a question. I don't know if I.
No, that's an important point. And I know that when we've talked about targets and other areas at the MPO, you know, we talk about the different levers that different partners in the UZA kind of have to pull, so to speak, in terms of helping to mitigate experiences of congestion. You know, there's a number of different ways that we specifically at the MPO can keep working towards that. You know, we, you know, have a number of projects that we've been supporting over the past couple years to, you know, help reduce non-OSFE travel, give people alternatives, ranging from the work we do through the Community Connections program to investments in projects like the Green Line extension. You know, we can, you know, take a look at the work that's coming up through not only corridor studies where we've recommended improvements to help mitigate congestion, including on some corridors that overlap the national highway system, but also projects in the TIP that we have in the pipeline to address some of these areas. Those are kind of the specific areas where we can and have been and continue to work in as the MPO level. Derek, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the things that can happen at the state level to help move us in that direction.
Sure. Yeah, I can add on. Yeah, we did discuss that. I think we looked at some of the trends documented in the projections so far through the telework study, which obviously will have an impact on congestion, and just with the sort of likelihood of potentially increased telework combined with, you know, the new carbon reduction funding from federal highway and the new bipartisan infrastructure law coming online, we, you know, we'll have a strategy in place by the time that 4-year target comes around. And so we thought, you know, through seeing how telework shakes out and different changes in kind of commuting patterns and things like that, combined with some of the additional funding we have specifically to address carbon reduction and congestion mitigation, we thought, you know, those were two sort of trends and factors to keep in mind for it. Plus to show that, you know, we are committed to this as a goal and in the spirit of setting an aspirational target, which, you know, we wanted to use this exercise to show as well. So those were some of the things we talked about as far as those levers to pull that Michelle mentioned.
All
Okay,
right.
I mean, that's helpful. I think though, I would just caution folks to also, be realistic. There are 13 million vehicle trips a day in the Boston region. There are only 1 million transit trips, even if you increase transit by 50%, and you're not, you're not going to, barring any substantial significant capacity increases, which is not on the horizon and not expected, obviously, or any pricing strategies that you may want to employ, or changes just in people's behavior. And Derek, you may have hit on, the teleworking issues and things like that, which may be. So I would just caution people, nothing wrong with being aspirational, but also temper your aspirations with some realism is what I would say. So thank you very much. This is helpful.
All right, any other questions? I don't see any, Michelle. So do you want to move on to the next part?
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to do that check-in with folks. Logan, could you move ahead to the emissions reduction measure slide? Thank you. So this measure, the last in the CMAQ measure and target family, is a little bit different, perhaps even more than a little different than the ones we've talked about thus far. Just to recap that definition, this is the total emissions reduction for applicable pollutants and precursors for CMAQ funded projects in designated non-attainment and maintenance areas. For myself, I like to think this boils down to how will the CMAQ projects that are being funded help to reduce relevant emissions. So when we're looking at this measure, it captures daily kilograms of the relevant pollutant that we're talking about for our non-attainment or maintenance areas that is reduced per day. And we're looking at this over a time scale for federal fiscal years 22 through 25. We look at federal fiscal years in this case because we're really talking about projects and when they're programmed and expected to be obligated, and that's obligated referring to when they're approved for reimbursement for federal funds. And so we're looking at the kind of a different time frame as opposed to the traffic congestion measures, where we're looking at it a calendar year in terms of when we're seeing the outcomes take place. Next slide, please. So this table captures what we really need to be looking at specifically for the Boston region. And to do that, I kind of break the measure definitions of the first part into two parts. So the first part is total emissions reduction for applicable pollutants and precursors. For our region, this is referring specifically to carbon monoxide, because we had that carbon monoxide limited maintenance area in Waltham, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is now expired. So when we're looking at pollutants and how much of their emissions are being reduced, we're looking specifically at those for carbon monoxide. Going down to that second row for the second part of the measure, we're looking at for CMAQ funded projects in designated non-attainment and maintenance areas. So in this case, we're looking really closely at projects that are overlapping what had been the Waltham limited maintenance area, which is basically the area covered by the city of Waltham. And so we're looking at CO reductions from CMAQ funded projects that are in or overlap Waltham that are programmed in our TIP for federal fiscal years 2022 through 25. Next slide, please. And so we look at these for 2 and 4 year targets. The first target for 2 years looks at what projects are included in our TIP in 2022 and 23. And the 4-year target looks at what projects are included over the 4-year period of federal fiscal years 2022 through 25. And the data that will be used to evaluate this is based on data that will be in the CMAQ public access system. And that captures the estimated emissions reductions from CMAQ funded projects, which are calculated when determining how the projects may have an air quality benefit. In Massachusetts, this is done as part of the statewide CMAQ consultation process to submit projects for potentially receiving CMAQ funding. MPOs and MassDOT staff use these standard spreadsheets that bring in a number of different inputs and assumptions about the project to calculate an air quality benefit. And those are the values that eventually incorporated into the public access system. Next slide, please. So looking across our TIP, we do have one project that meets the relevant criteria, and this is the NUMO expansion project, phase 2. And so the NUMO project is a project that is an on-demand transit service that operates in the city of Newton. And this service has been growing over the past couple of years and has apparently been really successful, which is really exciting. So this project has received funding, partial funding from the MPO in 2 different phases. We initially started contributing funding to NUMO through the Community Connections Program, starting in federal fiscal years 21 through 23. And that covered a phase of service. And talking about phases in the case of this project is a little artificial, but does help clarify when things are funded in the TIP and what the associated air quality benefits are. So that first phase included service to Newton and to the Needham Heights commuter rail station. There isn't an overlapping Waltham component in that section. This phase 2, which we're going to be contributing funding to starting in federal fiscal years 2023, is an expansion of that service that connects to a number of other neighboring towns, including Waltham, but also Watertown, Wellesley, Weston, and potentially Boston. In Waltham, that connection will particularly be to the Moody Street commuter rail station area. This expansion will also, contribute drivers to meet growing demand, and will also complete the NUMO's fleet transition to all electric zero emission vehicles. Next slide, please. So when we're estimating the air quality benefits of these different phases, as we do for all CMAQ projects, there are a number of different assumptions and estimates based on data that MPO staff collect from project proponents that go into our understanding of what the emissions reductions of these projects might be. So we look at the congestion impact, CO impacts that might accrue from new service in terms of the fleet being operated by all zero emission vehicles. We're not expecting there to be new emissions from providing the service. But we're also looking at the overall service operation, anticipated number of trips and ridership, as well as the potential characteristics of the trips that are being replaced. How far have people might have traveled, and how many trips might there have been had the NUMO service not been available as an alternative. And so calculating this for that phase 2 project as a whole, we're estimating approximately a reduction of 1.47 kilograms of CO reduced per day. Next slide, please. In working with the Federal Highway Administration, we were directed to try to capture what we expect the impact on Waltham to be specifically when we're setting targets. Because this service isn't operating yet and we don't have actual ridership values to work from to determine, where people will actually be taking trips on this on-demand service. We chose the approach of, developing our target, assuming that there will be connecting service to, the 4 confirmed communities, and then taking a quarter of that to reflect the emissions reductions in Waltham. So this generates a value of 0.354 kilograms of carbon monoxide reduced per day. And so this is the value that we were using as our 2- and 4-year targets. Next slide, please. So before I close out and request that the MPO members take action on this item, I just want to highlight a couple of things that will happen next. So pending approval of these targets, we will then be incorporating them into a CMAQ baseline performance plan that covers the years 2022 through 25 that gets submitted to MassDOT and FHWA. This document basically describes these performance targets as well as describes the CMAQ funded projects that we will have coming up over this period. In April 2023, when we're developing the TIP and talking about performance, you'll also see these targets reflected in that document. Of course, this information is all going into the development of our next long-range transportation plan, not only the development of a systems performance report for that plan, but just kind of the overall thinking that we're doing about our needs assessment, which includes this kinds of information and how that translates into the types of the investments that the MPO would like to make going forward. And finally, when we get to next October, that's when we're expecting to see the implications of the expiration of that Waltham limited maintenance area and to what degree we'll need to fulfill these CMAQ performance requirements going forward. Next slide, please. So just to recap the requested MPO actions, we're requesting a vote for the MPO to adopt the CMAQ traffic congestion targets. This is really important for us to ensure that we're reporting targets consistently with our partners in the urbanized area, and also requesting a vote on the emissions reduction target. Next slide, please. This table summarizes the targets that I've spoken about today. You can also find this on page 2 of the memorandum. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Michelle, do you want to do this as one vote, or should they be two separate, either Michelle or Derek? Does it matter?
I'm not sure that it does, Derek. I don't know if you have a preference.
I think as long as a motion is framed as a motion to approve all, I guess there's 6 targets, right? Just approving the 4 congestion targets and 2 emissions targets. I think that would suffice personally.
All right. First of all, does anyone have any questions before I ask for a motion? All right. Someone willing to make a motion, as Derek just talked about, that it's for the full 6 CMAQ performance targets, 2 for non-SOV, 2 for excessive delay, and then 2 for emissions reduction. Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to make a motion to approve the 6 targets.
All right. Thanks, Leonard. Eric?
I'll second the motion.
All right. Any last calls for any questions or comments? All right. Seeing none, Jonathan, you want to read the roll?
Steve Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore, who's replaced Jillian Linnell,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson, who's replaced Brian Kane, oh, Amira, I don't think we got your vote. You should be
Amira
able to-
Patterson, yes.
Thank you. Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Austin Saganowitz, we know has left the meeting. Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for your presentation. Let's go back to the agenda item, which is agenda item 9, our last action item, which is federal fiscal years 2023 to 2027 TIP Amendment 1. Ethan, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ethan Lapointe. I recently joined the Boston Region MPO as their TIP manager within the MPO activities group. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you with an overview of Amendment 1 to the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, for federal fiscal years 2023 through 2027. Should you have any questions through this presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Logan, next slide, please. The change we're proposing today marks the first amendment to the current federal fiscal year 2023 to 2027 TIP. The MPO's federal partners approved the Massachusetts Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, and by extension, the Boston Region MPO's TIP on October 12th, 2022. Amendment 1 proposes some changes to the 2023 program for updated cost estimates for 2 projects, the carry forward of MBTA funding for fiscal 2022 into 2023, and some new discretionary grant awardees from the MBTA that have come in since the May presentation of the TIP. Next slide, please. So just to start off with some of the Regional Target Highway Program projects, we have changes to 1 Community Connections project and 1 Complete Streets project for fiscal 23. For Community Connections, the Shanery Middle School Bicycle Parking Project is having its budget revised to reflect an updated quote from the vendor for bicycle racks based on cost increases for steel and other materials. We would like to note that the TIP Ad Hoc Committee has a policy for reviews of cost changes in excess of 25% as part of monitoring increase in costs for projects within the TIP. However, we believe that the relatively small overall budget for this project and the relatively small numerical increase in funding warrants pushing this change through with this amendment. To facilitate this change, we revised the fiscal 2023 budget for the Complete Streets project for Mount Auburn Street Rehabilitation in Watertown to capture that same amount. However, if we move to the next slide, you can see that the overall budget for this project remains the same as federal
Hey, how are you?
2024.
Bill, I think you're on. You got to mute, Bill. Thanks. Go ahead. Sorry, Ethan.
Not a problem. Federal fiscal year 2024 funding has been increased in line, so the project budget remains the same. Next slide, please. So moving on to the MBTA, we have a combination of carry forward changes for 3 categories of federal funds, Section 5307, Section 5337, and a pool of other federal funding, which includes FTA formula funds, grant awards, and other line items. This is a carry forward of unobligated fiscal year 2022 funding into fiscal 2023. As of October 1st, we are now in federal fiscal 2023, hence the changes. These changes represent adjustments that were made to the MBTA's Capital Investment Plan, or CIP, in May of this year after an extensive public review process, and the amendment is meant to reflect the current state of project readiness for projected fiscal year 2023 into 2027 spending for projects within that CIP. We're starting off with urbanized area formula grants from the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, referred to as Section 5307. These funds are provided to states and urban areas for capital and operating efforts, including planning, studies, station repairs, bus maintenance, and other uses. For this amendment, we have reflected increased funding levels from a carry forward of unused federal 2022 funds into federal fiscal 2023 for the Bridge and Tunnel Program, Revenue Vehicle Program, Signal Systems Upgrade Program, and Stations and Facilities programs. The final column for each of these lines shows the net changes to the lines over the 5 years. For this funding source, we have a $4.25 million reduction for Section 5307 for Bridge and Tunnel, a $150.88 million increase to revenue vehicles, which includes fleet work, a roughly even reallocation across signals and systems upgrade, and a decrease of $40.2 million approximately for the Station and Facilities program. Just to reiterate, this is just for Section 5307. If we go to the next slide, you can see the changes for Section 5337 for those same 4 programs. These come from the FTA State of Good Repair grants, which are commonly referred to as Section 5337. Again, this captures maintenance work, replacement, rehabilitation, and general state of good repair and asset management activities. Here we have a $65.5 million increase for bridge and tunnel, approximately $35.5 million decrease in the revenue vehicles program, a $93 million increase to signals and systems, and a $200 million increase to stations and facilities program funding. If we go to the next slide, just to make this a little bit more easy to digest, here's the bottom line when you combine those two changes between section 5307 and 5337, including their state match. We can see that we have an increase of 61.27 million for bridge and tunnel, a net increase of revenue vehicle program by 115.36 million, a net increase of $93 million approximately for the signal systems upgrade program, and an approximate net increase to the stations and facilities program of $159.82 million. So if we go to the next slide, here we start to move into the larger pool of other federal funds. There are two driving forces behind these changes. First, we have a number of projects that were not obligated in fiscal year 2022 and are again part of that same carry forward group. Second, thanks to the aggressive pursuit of a discretionary grant funding by the MBTA, this amendment reflects the receipt of multiple discretionary grant awards. We have projects including the North Wilmington Station Improvements, which received a Commuter Authority Rail Safety Improvement or CARSI grant, and the Quincy Bus Facility Modernization being carried forward, with amounts of $1.3 and $5 million respectively. South Station Commuter Rail, Chelsea and Everett Route Planning, and battery electric buses with low to no emissions both received discretionary grant awards since the last presentation of the TIP in April. Here we have $465,000 for South Salem Commuter Rail, $780,000 for Chelsea and Everett Route Planning, and then $136.47 million for the procurement of battery electric buses. Moving on to the next slide. This continues. We have the South Elm Street Bridge replacement in Haverhill and a new suicide trespass intervention line item funded by another Federal Railroad Administration discretionary grant in the amount of $15.19 million and $100,000 respectively. Next, we have two new grants that were provided under the bipartisan infrastructure law in the new federal administration, being RAISE grants, standing for Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. We have the Linway Multimodal Corridor, which was awarded this past spring for 2022 round in the amount of $27 million. And then we also have the Blue Hill Avenue Corridor project from the 2021 round of RAISE grants in the amount of $39.45 million being brought in with this amendment. If we move on to the next slide. Next, we have our congestion mitigation and air quality improvement funding. These projects generally represent emissions reducing activities that may improve or expand carbon reducing investments like transit or active transportation shifts. Some of these efforts that we have here include wayfinding improvements at Alewife Station in the amount of $292,000 and $280 in addition. The installation of bicycle racks at MBTA stations across the transit system for $275,740, and the second phase of the Columbus Avenue bus lanes and reconfiguration in Boston in the amount of $14.8 million. And again, these are all MBTA projects using congestion mitigation air quality improvement funding. Logan, next slide, please. So I would like to note that some of these changes, namely the MBTA line items, constitute an amendment to the TIP and others constitute an adjustment. However, for purposes of this presentation, staff requests that the MPO vote to move forward with Amendment 1. This will trigger a 21-day public comment period, and we are willing to open the floor to any questions or points of clarification from some of our partners.
So Ethan, just to clarify, I think we're going to do the adjustment. I think I'm going to call for the adjustment first. And that's still a roll call vote. And then, so first of all, on the adjustment for the community connections piece, is anyone willing to make a motion? Second, then I'll open it up to questions. And then we'll go to Amendment 1 on the MBTA items. Eric, and then Leonard.
So so you're looking for a motion on the community connections project.
First, let's do that first.
Okay, I'll make a motion to approve the community connections project changes.
All right, is there a second?
I'll second it, but I certainly have questions. Thank you.
All right,
Or a question.
All right, so we have motion second. This is on the adjustment. Leonard, Eric, did you have questions or just Leonard? Do you have a question?
I understand the low value amount, and I'm fine with approving it, but was there an explanation for it? Because it's almost double.
Yes, so to clarify, there was an updated quote that was received for this project. This is a bicycle rack project. As many of us know, there are ongoing fluctuations in prices across multiple different categories. This includes materials, namely funds like steel, and this changed the cost estimate for the project.
Okay, fine. I got it. Thank you. And so now I'm very happy to support it. Thank you.
All right, any other questions on the adjustment first? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, read the roll on the adjustment, please.
Steve Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
yes, and I should have just to remind everyone, you do have the ability to mute and unmute yourselves. So I just wanted to remind everyone that you can do that. Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everybody. All right, let's take up Amendment 1. Can I get a motion and a second to approve Amendment 1, which was all the changes to MBTA? Then we can open up to questions. Eric?
I'll make an emotion. I'll make an emotion.
You'll make an emotion, Eric?
A motion to approve Amendment 1, but I do have some questions.
Yes,
about that.
absolutely.
So if I could, when the opportunity is.
Yep. Leonard?
And I'll make an emotional second, and I have some questions too.
Oh, Jesus. I think we've coined a new term, Eric. All right, so we have a motion and second, so I'll have Eric and Leonard, and then anyone else has questions. Go ahead, Eric.
So my question, and maybe Laura, can answer this if our new tip manager cannot. Yeah, are most of these additional funds either additional formula funds or the grants that we received?
Go ahead, Laura. Or Ethan, whoever.
So I may defer to Ethan and to Eric, who's also here to listen in on this conversation. But so my understanding, and I want to get this across first, is that there was a little bit of confusion over what was on this amendment, and we've talked offline with several CTPS staff and with MassDOT about the fact that there may need to be some changes to the tip table to reflect what was provided by the T. And so I think there was some specific confusion about the way that some of the funding sources were combined, and so that may not be as clear on here. But there are some projects that are new awards, not carryovers, that may be misshown here. Derek or Ethan, is there anything that you would want to clarify about that?
Yeah, I would just note, obviously, apologies for the confusion. This was resulting from some of the materials that we were provided with regard to the funding. However, I would note that the bottom line funding adjustments for these projects remains the same. It's namely a difference in presentation as to what sources are being used and then when those sources were received. So in the case of carry forward funding, this was fiscal year 2022 funding, which is not represented within the 2023 to 27 STIP or TIP. that is now being brought forward into 2023 as effectively functionally new funding, even though it's not, because it was not obligated in fiscal 2022. This was also being conflated with some discretionary grant awards that are also new to the TIP that have been awarded since this past spring when the TIP was last presented, and then also when the capital investment plan for the MBTA was approved. The purpose of this amendment is effectively to bring these two documents, the TIP and the CIP, into alignment. At the end of the day, the funding bottom line is identical there.
Okay.
We
Okay.
will
So
post the revised materials online after this meeting, though, to reflect those changes.
I always forget that with the FTA formula funds, there's more flexibility, right? About being able to move some of those funds into other years, whereas with the federal highway funds, it's more rigid. We can't move them. So okay, so that answers that question. So some of this is related to the RAISE grants. That's sort of new, sort of net new to the region, but the bulk of it, like the electric buses and things like that, that's formula funds that had previously been in like fiscal year 22 that's now being moved into 23 just based on sort of T's planning and timing of things, and like you said, Ethan, aligning with the decisions that were made as part of the MBTA CIP that was adopted after we had done the last TIP.
Yes, thank you. That's my understanding of it.
Thanks.
All right, Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This may go to Laura. So I see a lot that's moved from the later years, like 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, into 23. Am I correct in my observation?
Yes, you are correct there.
Okay.
I think Eric Warama, who's on this call, may be able to speak to that more.
Okay. And are these monies are these new projects, or they were projects that were planned for those outer years and they were done, or they're going to be done this year?
So these programs, and this is my understanding, and Eric, feel free to weigh in if you want to clarify. These projects are line items that are funded each year and are generally a catch-all of other projects. The general funding levels for these programs change year by year. So what's being presented on these slides are the deltas, not necessarily the net changes to their budgets or the overall budget amount, to clarify.
So Jim, I see you, but let me call on Eric Warman if he can clarify some of the stuff, and I'll come right back to you, Jim, okay? And Leonard, were you done actually? Do you have more questions, or?
I may have one more question.
All right, let's get Eric to talk, and then
it was just one more, I think.
All right, so Leonard, let me get Eric to maybe he'll.
Yeah, please. Yeah,
right,
please.
go ahead, Eric.
Eric, how are you doing?
Oh, there you go.
I think I am.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not really a shift from the out years into the FY23. That increase in FY23 is really the carryover of funds from FY22 into 23. 24 through 27 in total are exactly the same in terms of formula funds. It's the exact same amount of funding available, the same amount of federal funding programmed for 24 through 27, at least for the formula funds. And as was already mentioned, there are a few discretionary grants awarded since April. So that would be kind of a net increase in funding. That would include the projects like the battery electric bus and South Elm Street Bridge, the potential, the at least planned transfer of the Linway multimodal corridor RAISE grant to the FTA, to the MBTA. So there is a net change for FY23, but for the most part, at least for the formula funds, it's all of a shift from 22 into 23. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. That was helpful. I don't have any other questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, Leonard. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, so Eric Barasa kind of clarified for me my confusion as well, because I always have this mindset of the FHWA funds that says, you can't carry them over into the next fiscal year, and you gotta use them or lose them kind of thing. So we're always stuck scrambling sometimes at the end of federal fiscal year to switch projects around that aren't ready. So I don't expect an answer, but it just seems very strange that FTA funds have this flexibility, which I think ultimately is a good thing, because I do support all these projects staying and hopefully staying on target, and fine with adding them to 23, but it's just, I don't think anyone can answer the question, but it just does seem strange that there's this level of flexibility for FTA, but not FHWA.
So Jim, I can tell you from my many years doing this, including when I was MBTA, there's always had the ability to carry over FTA funds. It's just a difference in the two programs. So it's nothing new.
Right. And has anyone,
Just like I'm not new, it's nothing new.
I mean, I've been around as long as you, but I just,
Yeah.
and I guess I've always wondered why there's flexibility and whether or not anyone has thought of transferring that flexibility to FHWA type funding. But maybe it's an old question and it just is what it is.
All right. Anyone else have any questions on Amendment 1? Laura?
So just the clarification that there is going to be a minor change in the format of how the projects are broken out, and that will be updated and sent out to the MBTA board during the comment period. So the bottom line numbers are the same, but we had some changes to how that was structured.
So what I would expect is the T to submit something to CTPS so they can share with the MPO members before we take this up whenever it's time to take this up at the next future meeting. All right, Laura. All right, anything else? Seeing none, Jonathan, please read the roll.
Steve Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Sarah Lee has left us. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Mira Patterson,
Amir Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Higgins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Eric Johnson,
Eric Johnson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ethan. All right, let's move to agenda item 10, member items. Anyone have anything? Yes, Brad.
Thank you, Chair. We mentioned this in members' items 6 months ago, but I wanted to thank this board for ongoing historical support for MBTA's Green Line Extension project. We're getting so close on opening branch 2 for revenue service, which is to Medford Hillside Tufts neighborhood. So back when branch 1, that soft launch occurred back in March, we just mentioned to you all, look, this is our work. This is multiple generations of MPO staff and board members, and the stuff doesn't come easy. Thank you for the stick-to-itiveness. Thanks for following through on our collective commitments to mass transit expansions in the metro area. This topic came up earlier today, Chair, so I also wanted to kind of balance that commercial and that gratitude with some dialogue that we have heard in legislative hearings, MBTA Advisory Board forum the other day. The tensions that this region and this Commonwealth will struggle with between system expansion and state of good repair and safety work. I believe that the Green Line extension has been perhaps unfairly singled out as a poster child for this tension, suggesting that when our partners at the MBTA try to tackle big systemic changes and system expansions, that we collectively run the risk of taking our eye off the ball on basic state of good repair and safety work. I strongly believe that that's a false choice, and I want to remind this board, as we thank you for your investments, the Green Line extension is an air quality mitigation requirement associated with Mass DOT's Big Dig Central Artery Highway Extension Project. We discussed a really important and detailed presentation from Michelle on the CMAC program and our emissions reductions targets. Let's all remember that our forebears worked together to mitigate the impacts of that once in a lifetime big dig project, and that the Commonwealth chose the GLX to mitigate the emissions impacts of that highway expansion. It wasn't a discretionary or selective project for the communities of Medford, Somerville, or Cambridge. It was a regional mitigation requirement. And so I think this is important for all of our work going forward, especially given the active discussions about the future of transit in the Commonwealth, the future of highway work, and our ongoing climate safety and equity dialogue. I'm so glad that Mass DOT is hosting a public meeting tonight, and look forward to continuing to partner with this MPO and all of our related stakeholders as we work together to move the Commonwealth safer and greener in the future. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Brian. Anyone else? All right, seeing none, can I get a motion second to adjourn, please?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Leonard Diggins seconds.
All right, all in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
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 Aye. All right, thank you, everybody. Be safe out there. Have a good Halloween. Hopefully I'll see a bunch of you on November 1st over at the Park Plaza Hotel. Thanks, everybody.
I'll be going to Stevie at Marlow. Bye-bye.